Hi folks, this is a video without a specific purpose really, other than to say that there are spears and there are spears. In some of the discussions that I've had on this channel and on forums, people sometimes make sweeping statements regarding spears. There are clearly common types of spear that were common throughout history. However, what you have to remember also is that there are extremes at either end of that spectrum. And I've just got two examples here to show that and for you to perhaps to think about and discuss. So here we have a spear. This is from somewhere in Africa, and you'll notice it has a fairly large head but fairly long and fairly thin. It's a bit like a Zulu assegai in shape, but it's not a Zulu assegai because notice it has a socket, and Zulu assegais instead have a tang. If you ever see someone selling something like this and calling it an assegai, they're conning you. It's not Zulu, it's from somewhere else. Who knows where this is from, I don't know. But you'll notice that the shaft is very, very thin. It's about as thick as a thick longbow arrow in actual fact. It's about, what is that, about a centimetre thick, something like that. Pretty thin for a spear. Now clearly I could use this in hand-to-hand combat if the opponent didn't have a weapon of their own perhaps, or if I was using it with a large shield perhaps, if I was just using it for poking with. But clearly that shaft to me is not intended really for hand-to-hand combat. This is to me intended for throwing at people. Or not necessarily people, but animals perhaps. It could be for hunting. Although it's a very large head, I think, for hunting. I don't think you'd usually have such a big head as that unless you wanted to frighten someone or have a bit of a status symbol. But there we go. I think that pretty much is more like a javelin than a spear, as we'd call it, even though the head is quite big. Okay, so big head, thin shaft. You have to look at the whole weapon to consider what it might be for. Now, in contrast, I have this. It's a spear with a head which is about the same size as my head. And this I'm fairly sure is from the Sudan, probably from the end of the 19th century. It's possible it was brought back to Britain after the Omdurman campaign in 1898, when huge numbers of Sudanese people, warriors, were shot down, gunned down, and their weapons were gathered up and brought back as trophies to Britain. And as a result, there are lots of so-called dervish or Sudanese Kaskara swords and indeed large spears like this in old houses in Britain, because lots of them were brought back and sold. However, also in the subsequent years, in the 1900, 1910, 1920, people went on holiday to Africa on safari and such like and brought back examples for themselves. So it's, although it's not really, Sudan isn't usually where you go for safari, that's more South Africa and Kenya and so on. But nevertheless, some of them were brought back and they were still making them in the same style, so it's very difficult to date these things. But the fact is, this is of a style that was in use in the 19th century by dervishes in the Sudan, and it's a very big spearhead. In use, I suspect they're almost somewhat similar to a partisan in medieval or Renaissance Europe. Yes, you could cut with it quite effectively. It will cut like a kind of, a bit like a glaive, I suppose, or a partisan. It's on a fairly thick shaft. The shaft is sort of what you'd normally expect a spear shaft to be in thickness. These spearheads are quite big, and the Sudanese examples, this one doesn't have it, I think because this shaft is not original, but a lot of Sudanese spears actually have an iron sort of strip curled around the bottom end of the spear as a counterbalance, essentially so that you can hold the spear further away from the head and still have some control with the point, much like balancing a sword. So there we go, two entirely different types of spearhead, but I guess the main point I want to make is actually look at the shafts. The biggest difference is not really in the heads. Both of the heads could cut, they can both definitely stab, but the real big difference is in the shafts. One is clearly meant for fighting in close against someone else, hand to hand, and the other one, to me, is probably not. It's probably meant for throwing. So don't always judge a spear by its head. That's the proverb of today. Thank you.